Hello, students. So we are now going to work through our very last lesson in Chapter 1. So have your notes ready and open, and your math books are going to be on page 42. Now, this lesson is called an extension lesson, but it's super important in this chapter because coming from elementary school, we aren't certain whether everybody understands fully how to add and subtract fractions. A lot of you probably do, but just in case, we're going to go through this lesson to have a quick reminder on how to do that. So in our notes, we will write down our learning target to start with. Today's lesson, we're going to try to use the lowest common multiple to add and subtract fractions. So our learning target will say, I can use the least common multiple to add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. So a couple of little vocabulary things about a fraction here. I know a lot of you guys already know this, but I want to make a fraction bar. It's going to be a big one because I'm going to name the top and the bottom. The top of the fraction, remember, is called the numerator, and the bottom is called the denominator. So in our learning target where it says we're doing this with unlike denominators, that means the bottom numbers are going to be different, and we're going to have to add or subtract the numbers in our fraction by changing the fractions so that the bottom numbers are the same. You cannot add or subtract fractions unless the denominators are the same. So I'm going to put to add or subtract fractions, be sure to have a common denominator. You cannot add or subtract fractions unless you have that common denominator. So on page 42, if we take a look at the top, it says recall that you can add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators by writing equivalent fractions with a common denominator. So we have to change the fractions just a little bit in order to add or subtract them. So for example 1, we'll go ahead and switch colors here. The directions say adding fractions using a common denominator. So they're asking us to find 5/8 plus 1/6. So we want to look at the bottom denominators here and notice that they are different. We cannot just add these up if they're different on the bottom. So what we're going to do is rewrite the fractions with a common denominator. And one way you can do this is just multiply the 8 times 6 together and see what you get. So 8 times 6 would be 48. So that means I'm going to take 5/8 and change it to something out of 48, and I'm going to take 1/6 and change it to something over 48. So if I want 5/8 to turn into something over 48, I have to ask myself, what did I do to the 8 to get to 48? And I multiplied by 6. Remember over here we multiplied by 6. So whatever you do to the bottom of the fraction, you have to do to the top. So I have to also multiply the top times 6. So 5 times 6 on the top would give me 30. So 5/8 turns into 30 over 48. Now we'll do the same thing with 1/6. 1/6 is going to turn into something over 48. So what did I do to the 6 to get to 48? I multiplied it by 8 to get to 48. So I multiply this by 8 on the bottom, and I have to do the same thing to the top. 1 times 8 would be 8. So 1/6 in our original question becomes 8 over 48. Now that the bottoms are the same, I can go ahead and add the numerators. So my new question would be 30 over 48 plus 8 over 48. Now the rules are when we add and subtract fractions, we keep the denominator as it is because we just did all of that work to try and get it there. And we just add up the numerators. So 30 plus 8 would give me 38. Now, there's one more step here because 38 over 48 is not simplified down to its smallest version. We have to take this and simplify it. So I'm going to rewrite it over here and talk about how to simplify fractions. I need to think of something that can go into 38 that can also go into 48. And I'm going to divide by that number to get a smaller version of this fraction. So I'm going to simplify. Well, I noticed that 38 ends in an even number and 48 also ends in an even number. So I'm going to divide both the top and the bottom by 2. If I take 38 and I cut it in half or divide it by 2, I end up with 19 on the top. If I take 48 and divide it by 2 or cut it in half, I end up with 24 on the bottom. Now what we would do next is decide if these two numbers can be divided by something else evenly. They actually cannot because 19 is a prime number. So 19 over 24 is going to be our final answer when we add these two fractions together. And so that strategy is using a common denominator. We're actually going to solve the exact same question. We're going to use a different strategy of doing it. So in our last problem, we just found any common denominator that we could think of by multiplying the denominators together. For example 2, we're going to use the lowest common denominator. So what's going to happen here is when we figure out what 5/8 plus 1/6 look like, that's the same problem from before. We're going to start out this time by figuring out what the lowest common denominator is for the two numbers on the bottom. So 8 and 6. Excuse me. So I'm going to count by 8s. We have 8, we have 16, then we have 24. Over here we have 6, and then I'll count by 6s. 12, 18, and 24. So if you notice on both lists, the lowest common is going to be 24. So if I change my fraction so that there's a 24 on the bottom, you'll notice that that's what our final answer becomes over here. So if I change 5/8 to something out of 24, excuse me, I know I multiplied 8 times 3 to get to 24. So 5 times 3 would give me 15. I now need to take 1/6 and make it out of 24. 6 times what is 24? Well, I multiplied by 4. So I have to do the same thing to the top. 1 times 4 is 4. So now I can take 15 24ths and 4 24ths and add those two together. So remember, the bottom stays the same. We do not change the bottom. 15 plus 4 gives me 19. Now the strategy of using the lowest common denominator actually gets you to the answer quicker because notice how my answer here is actually the final answer. I don't have to take that extra step to simplify. Up here in example 1, we took our answer after we added and we had to simplify it down to its lowest version because we didn't use the lowest common denominator. Here, we found the lowest common denominator so that when we found our answer, we didn't have to cut it down any further. So that's how you use the LCM to find your final answer. All of those examples were on page 42. So now if we look at page 43, we'll see our last example for this page, and for the lesson, I should say. So it says, to add or subtract mixed numbers, first rewrite the numbers as improper fractions and then find the common denominator. So the next example is going to give us some mixed numbers. And remember, mixed numbers are numbers that have a fraction and a whole number in them. So they're kind of mixed up. So let's go ahead and start a new page here for example 3. Example 3 says, I want to find 4 3/4 and subtract 2 3/10. So we cannot do this math until we've changed this mixed number into an improper fraction. So in parentheses over here, I'm going to name these mixed numbers, just to make sure we remember what these are called. These are mixed numbers because there's a whole number and a fraction all in one. And we have to change this into improper. So the way we do this is we take the whole and we multiply it by the denominator, and then we add the numerator. So I'm going to make a little asterisk here and write those steps down. The whole times denominator and then we add numerator. If you follow those steps, you're going to take this and make it an improper fraction. So 4 times 4, and then we add the 3. So 4 times 4 is 16, plus 3 more is 19. This becomes 19 on the top, and you keep the denominator the same. So 4 3/4 becomes 19/4. So the same thing to the other one. We have 2 3/10, so we take the whole, times it by the denominator, and add the numerator. So 2 times 10 is 20, plus 3 more is 23. So this becomes 23 over 10. Now what I'm going to do next is label this improper fractions. This is what an improper fraction looks like because the top is bigger than the bottom. So now that we've taken these and made them improper, we now have to do the subtraction because the original problem asked us to subtract these two questions. Now again, in order to subtract, we have to find a common denominator between 4 and 10. So again, we want to try and find the lowest common denominator in order to figure out how to find this without simplifying. So if I list some 4s and some 10s, we have 4, 8, 12, 16, and 20. We have 10, 20, and I can stop there. So what I'm noticing here is the lowest common denominator for this set is actually when you multiply them both together. So I'm going to change 19/4 into something out of 20. So what did I do to that 4 to get to the 20? 4 times 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to multiply by 5 on the top and on the bottom. So when I take 19 and I times it by 5, I end up with 95. So I'm going to have 95 over 20. So 19/4 turns into 95 over 20. Now I'm going to take 23/10 and I'm going to change it into something out of 20. So to get from 10 to 20, I multiply by 2. So to do the same thing to the top. So 23 times 2 gives me 46. So 23/10 turns into 46/20. So I have 95/20, subtract 46/20, and that's going to give me my answer. So remember, the denominator does not subtract, it's just the numerators that subtract. So when I take 95, subtract 46, that gives me 49 over 20. Now, if you take a look at this fraction, a lot of kids would stop there, but it is not actually simplified into its lowest form because it's improper. So what we need to do now is change this improper fraction back to a mixed number. So I'm going to rewrite it over here so I have a little bit more space. First thing I need to do is ask how many 20s can go into 49. And there are 2 20s that can go into 49. So I'm going to make a big 2, a whole number of 2, because 2 times 20 would give me 40. Now, what's the leftovers? If 2 times 20 is 40, it looks like there are 9 leftovers. So my leftovers go on the top of my fraction, and my denominator stays the same. 2 and 9/20 is going to be our final answer to that subtraction problem. And that brings us to an end to our last lesson in Chapter 1. If you'd like to go ahead and look at the bottom practice section, there's not as many practice problems in this lesson as there is in a regular lesson, since this is an extension lesson. You can go ahead and work on those if you'd like, if you have extra time, and we'll probably do some in class as well. And that completes Chapter 1.